Welcome to Product AMA, your daily online Ask Me Anything. We started Product AMA to give those passionate or curious about product management a daily break, something to look forward to. The format is 1 hour in length, weekdays at 3 p.m. Eastern. The first 30 minutes will always be a guest and a featured topic. The last 30 minutes is devoted to you, the audience, to ask your questions.
Our topic today is scaling rapid experimentation at Loblaw Digital. And joining us to help explain that are two of the senior directors in product at Loblaw Digital, Nashib Qadri and Kim Phelan. Welcome to at Product AMA, Nash and Kim.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
So thanks so much for joining us. We've been having a lot of fun with this and some really interesting conversations. So I'm looking forward to hearing both about how you guys work with product at Loblaw Digital, and also, let's talk about what's going on in the current environment, because we all know, like from personal experience, that it's been a rocky road, and I'm sure you guys are, working hard at adapting. But I'd like to start off with a question about your careers in product and just, how did you end up getting to Loblaw Digital? So maybe Nash, you could start. I think you started on the development side with IBM, right? And then you spent some time in fintech before Loblaw. But can you tell us a bit about what led you to Loblaw?
Yeah. Happy to do that. Thanks, Lee. So a couple of things. When I was on the development side, so I studied CS and I took sort of the standard, dev trajectory, and I was, because I was sort of taking on progressively, I'll say, more responsibility at IBM. And then I really at some point about 10 or 12 years ago, I was really asking myself whether I wanted to invest more into this or I wanted to try to learn something new. And the call of sort of the new and interesting, but still related to tech. So I started out in telco, and there were a lot of, they used to have this discipline, but really it was called sort of product line management. And you really, they were responsible for a lot more P&L responsibility. They had a lot more accountability for direct business results and things like that. And I thought, hey, that's kind of interesting. And my reading sort of changed. My interest kind of went from reading, more techie stuff to reading like The Economist more and sort of understanding how sort of business works. And also I saw, a number of companies that I thought had great tech were not really doing very great. And so I kind of started to think about what does make them succeed. And, as I started to think about those things about 10 years ago, I decided I've been actually fairly along in my development career, and I felt like it was really hard, especially at IBM at the time. A lot of their product groups were based not in Ottawa. I was in Ottawa at the time. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to go do an MBA. And, I think for me, it was useful. It's not necessarily useful for everyone. I sincerely believe that, but definitely very useful for me because it gave me this new vocabulary. And then I started to sort of think more about everything from inception to, how long do you keep the product in the market and when do you know to retire it and things like that. Mm. At that point at IBM, they were starting to, IBM was basically losing to some of the, big FANG companies. And so they were trying to do two things. One was they were trying to bolster their hardware revenue, and they were trying to fend off this attack from these guys on the software side. So they formed a group that was going to come up with novel solutions where the hardware, software, everything came prepackaged as a device. An expensive device, like starting at, $100K up to $5 million type of thing. But that's where I really began to understand that it was really important to get that mix of, what is this thing actually worth just right? And who's our buyer? So you talk to a ton of people that get excited about the technology, then you'd go to actually try to sell it. And the sales team was like, I don't know, this thing just doesn't sell. Like, what is this thing? It's very hard to sell. And so it became really clear that you needed the product teams to really define why you were doing things. For the sales team to be bought in, you needed them to bring in the customer problems, because sales teams at IBM were often technical. They were pretty competent. And they would sort of come in and say, hey, this is the problem we need to solve. And then I started to understand that there was something getting lost in translation between what's the customer problem to, hey, we're building this stuff. Because, like clockwork, we would put out new releases every quarter, which at the time was considered pretty great, because we were following this Eclipse model where they would have a new milestone build come hell or high water. Every 6 weeks, there was a new build, and it had a whole bunch of new capability in it. So I really started to think about then, how, not in isolation, obviously, with assistance from a whole bunch of really smart folks on the marketing side, on the on sort of the hardware side, thinking about what are the problems we're really trying to solve. And it became clear to me that, two things I absolutely loved about product management. The first one was sort of bringing clarity to the problem that you're solving. So everybody's like, oh, we should do this, we should do that. And, in the end, if you dig hard enough, most of the time, not all of the time, there is some reasonable amount of data that you can rely on to help you make your decision. And so it became clear to me that that's kind of the stuff I love doing, finding out what's the problem, talking to customers, getting out of the building. Really, when I moved to the consumer space with Ecobee, and then with LD, of course, I really love the fact that you were talking to the user of your product, and it was so accessible. And the way I ended up here is, I decided to leave IBM because I felt like, there wasn't enough stuff that was exciting. They weren't willing to take enough risks. And I happened to meet Aziz at a meetup, and we were talking about some interesting problems. We were talking about scaling. We were talking about how to build really great experiences like customers love. And he's like, whoa. And I wasn't very happy at my job at the fintech company. And so he said, why don't you come work with us? And, and basically the rest is history. I joined them and really loved the product. And one of the things I'm going to say about LD, like I've been working a long time, one of my favorite parts about LD is that every year it feels like I have a new focus, a new set of problems to go and solve. So it's been pretty exciting for years.
Nice. That's great for, those of us that maybe on the borderline of ADD, we really need to have constantly new stimulation and new projects, right? So that's great. Thank you for that. So Kim, you're pretty well known in the community, and certainly I've known you for many years with your work at Two Cows and Achievers and ClearFit. And then more recently, you kind of got into the food side of things with Touch Bistro and Chef Hero. So what's different about your role at Loblaw Digital, and why did it appeal to you at this point in your career?
So, obviously, I worked with you at Two Cows a million years ago, it feels like. And after a long number of years, I guess that's 18 years or something like that, in startup product management, I was really curious about, how could I learn new skills? Eventually, if you've been the first product manager, the first VP of product, or anything like that, it's a lot of the same problem, different customer, different product, different focus, but a lot of the same problems, which is teaching the organization what product management is, going through the motions of what that is. Oh, what is the first roadmap? Great. But eventually that muscle is overused. And I want to learn how to do it at a larger company. And when it comes to impact, there's not any bigger impact than Loblaw from an organization perspective. One of the numbers that blows my mind is there's 18 million people in PC Optimum. Well, we could be touching 3/4 of the adult population. Considering the last company I was at had 400 customers, the difference is significant and staggering. So that was a big, I was really attracted to that idea. Also B2C. Everything I've done to this point has been B2B, and you get a lot of tools at your disposal. You get a lot of face time with, customers, you get a lot of, sales reps, etc. It's a very different experience to learn that. So that was another thing that I was super interested in. And then also, I'm not so concerned about stability. Like, I mean, if you've done 8 startups, you're not so concerned about stability. But it is nice to, you know, things that we do at Loblaw are things like a 3-year plan. I've never done a 3-year plan at a startup ever, because they weren't sure if they'd be around in 3 years. So, you know, like you might get a roadmap for maybe a quarter, 2, 3, maybe if you were really lucky. But generally it was you didn't get that long-term vision of where they wanted to be. We have a strategic exercise called the Big Think, where you're supposed to think big, of course, about things that are like the moonshots of where we're going to head as a company. Well, you don't get to do that in an environment that's startup driven. You definitely have the dreams of your investors, but you know, like there's a comparison there. So it's been really interesting. But the one thing I've appreciated is that all that experience I had from startups is really applying, because, you know, how do you teach a group of people who think long term to build an MVP? Like, what does MVP look like if you work for a company that's been around for 100 years? You have to kind of build that type of thing in. Nash will talk a little bit more about experimentation. What does it mean to learn and pivot and do all those things that startups are really good at? And how do you bring that type of spirit into a larger organization? So there's lots of reasons, but not a regret in the slightest.
No, that's great. It's like you're scaling your career to some extent. You know, take your skill set and see, okay, let's see if this can scale, and you know, in a bigger environment. That's awesome. You mentioned you know, the move from B2B to B2C.
Yep.
So I'm curious about some of the stuff you guys are working on at Loblaw Digital, because obviously there's lots of things that we all know about that are customer facing, but I assume you're also working on some digital, you know, innovations that are for the company, right? Can you talk just a little bit about that? Like not necessarily specific things, but how do you kind of balance those two things?
Yeah, I mean, most of the things that Loblaw Digital does is definitely a customer facing. I mean, if I had to think about, you know, there is an entire Loblaw IT infrastructure. They take care of a lot of the tools for us internally. We have a lot of, obviously, productivity tools and things like that we build for ourselves. Some businesses have other pieces. So, for example, the business that I work on called Marketplace, we are actually B2C and B2B. So because we have to work with sellers along with consumers as well. So there's a bunch of stuff there. Nash could probably speak to other things in that area too. But mostly we are asked to be that customer facing design and apps, etc.
Okay, cool. That helps a lot. I guess, Nash, maybe sort of, you know, building on that, can you tell us a little bit about how the product teams at Loblaw Digital are organized?
So there's a few things that we can't talk about. So when, you know, we definitely think about the customer facing experiences quite a bit. And I think, you know, that's everyone thinks about those things, but and it's good. I think there's definitely a very different sort of mindset about putting the customer front and center. So we're getting much better at it. It's very clear across many different businesses, but one of the things that I think, you know, typically when I worked in previous jobs, sort of the scales were very long. So, and you didn't look at your revenues every week. In fact, we look at them every day and every week. And this is a very traditional retail thing. It's not that, you know, we're insanely disciplined or anything like that. This is a standard retail practice. And what you then realize is that in product, what you're building is a machine for the business to operate, and they will then put the right products and surface them the right way to make sure that customers find what they're looking for easily. You know, our job is essentially to not bleep it up, you know, because when they arrive at sort of the cart and the checkout, you just want to get out of their way, because they're either really very interested in sort of gauging if they're willing to pay the price, or they want the thing. So I think for product, those are kind of the key moments. They arrive at the site, you offer them a good consideration set. This is done by building the right tools for the business so that they can load the consideration sets with ease. And so I think, you know, a lot of these tools are now for operating the business. They don't have the customer in terms of improving their sort of, well, I mean, they do, but the indirect benefit is through the business folks operating that in a much better way. So we build a lot of those kinds of tools to make life easier. We call them sort of the merchandising team. And so we make the merchandising team sort of have a better life so that our customers can find what they're looking for example. And then if you take that a little bit further, we think about when we receive all these products in sort of big feeds and, something goes wrong and, everything sort of falls apart because you need the product feed so you're going to understand the promo prices. And so there's a series of dependencies. So we're getting better and better about building large systems that remove these tech dependencies so that we can build something robust so that the business teams can now say, hey, I want this product. I know I can get it up on the homepage in this like top carousel because it's the hottest stuff and people want it and it'll sell like hotcakes. Otherwise, it's a lost opportunity. So I think a bit of my product thinking has changed from like there's in retail specifically, there's multiple clients that you're serving at the same time. Certainly your end customer above everything else, but also other clients in the chain.
So is it a bit more like a platform, where you're really focused on the user experience and the ability to manage content regardless of what that content is?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. It is more about, you need a robust platform so that you can be as dynamic as possible. And this is all about building that robust platform with a view to getting stuff in front of the customer. I think, Kim's gone through this experience most recently, and a lot of marketplace was about building the tools to, onboard products and sellers and so on. You can speak to it with much more competence than I can.
Yeah, well, sorry, Kim, you were gonna break in. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to mention, and now I understand your question better, is we also have to what Nash is saying, we have internal customers. I've now been thrown into the deep end on online grocery, and we have a whole picking app. So those pickers are using an app that we build to go through the grocery store to find those groceries as fast as possible. You name it, every piece of that operational chain, we are inserting ourselves into that process to get that online order into your hands.
Yeah, and that's especially critical right now as things are changing. And let's come back to that in a moment, because I think that's a fascinating area about how does a scalable organization then adapt and turn on a dime when conditions change. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Just for everybody that's online participating and listening, just as a reminder, we are taking questions from you. So we'll ask those of Nash and Kim as they come in, but please add them into the chat window, and we'll keep monitoring that. So Nash, just back to that question for a moment. Give us some understanding of how the product management teams are actually structured. Do you have kind of a designer product developer pairing, or how does that sort of work?
I think to be completely transparent, we looked at Amazon as a model for us, and we're not, copying them without thinking about it, but we're definitely using them as the model for our structure. And the way we structure sort of a pod is, it's basically got a product manager, or if the pod is very small, a fraction of a product manager and a fraction of a designer. Typically, we try to keep them whole, because otherwise, they end up working 3/4 of 2 jobs, and that's 1.5 jobs, which is not really scalable. So, and a TPM. So the TPM is typically responsible for, removing technical barriers, getting stuff live. They deal with the live environments, removing blockages for everything to do with going live. And then, of course, the dev teams. So this unit together of designer, PM, TPM, and the dev group form a pod basically, and each of these pods are on beauty are focused and pharmacy are focused on a specific outcome. So for example, if we were building a new feature on beauty to allow for, in beauty, one of the hottest promos is something called a gift with purchase. So when you make a purchase that you become eligible for a gift, and I can't say this with a straight face, but its value is supposed to be like $500, and you're buying it for $50. But these things are insanely popular. they literally sell out in like 2 hours. So, and the site gets hammered every time we have one of these things. So, we would build, for example, a pod, not build a pod. One of the pods would take on this full outcome to getting this gift with purchase live. And they would probably take on the next thing, which is called a purchase with purchase. And a gift with purchase is this free gift that you remember. Sorry, I just described a purchase with purchase. Pardon me. A purchase with purchase is you are entitled to buy something. If you already spend $100, you can buy another extra for 50. And those are also incredibly popular. So what we do is we structure them around teams like that. Or we structure the teams around focused initiatives like that. And then when that is complete and live in production, then we may move them on to something else. We've just started this. We're trying to get them a more sort of fulsome view of the entire product, so they then work on something different. But that's how the teams are structured. In terms of product teams themselves, we typically like to keep product managers with focus on a very specific part of the experience. So for instance, we have a product manager on Shoppers Drug Mart who works on the Shoppers Drug Mart app. And we have two others that work on the beauty side, and one other one who works on pharmacy. So they take on a part of the experience, a specific problem to be solved for the customer, and then that entire team is focused on delivering against that.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess it's a bit of a delicate balance when you get into a large portfolio like that, where you want to have continuity in the product line because people build up knowledge and experience there. But at the same time, you want them to kind of see things from other perspectives, maybe get involved in some other innovation projects and that kind of thing. So
you nailed it. I mean, I think that's where sort of the art piece comes in. There's no exact way to do this. You have to be ready also for people who want the change, and there are sometimes people who don't want the change. So there's a bit of a balance to be struck there. But yeah, absolutely. I think all of the things you said make sense.
Cool. Hey, just as a reminder for the participants online, we are taking questions for Kim and Nash, so please put them into the chat and we'll get to them as we get along here. So Kim, let's turn back to the kind of the current environment, and you were working on the marketplace, and now all of a sudden you've had to sort of join a SWAT team on PC Express, and you've seen a huge shift in demand. Tell us a little bit about kind of the original strategy with PC Express, and how have the teams kind of pivoted and adapted to this unprecedented demand?
Yeah, so I mean, right now, I know for my team, we started a marketplace. We are currently putting most of the COVID-19 priorities first, and then marketplace comes second or third thereafter. So we're definitely trying our best, but when it comes to demand, I mean, I can't get into numbers, but like realistically, multipliers more than our regular business. The site traffic itself is just like multipliers bigger than our biggest day of the year. We have this thing we call it Plinko internally. It's points days. It's like kind of like Amazon Prime days for PC Optimum points. We're getting multipliers above that day. So anyways, the things that we've had to do to pivot to what that is has been really interesting. And the roadmap is like, it's really based on what is happening because it's so unpredictable. The first 2 weeks were frankly really hard because the site was down because we had never hit that kind of traffic before. Like it just from a perspective of just the whole thing was insane. So we had tech teams focused on stability. So how do we keep that site up? How do we optimize as fast as possible to try to keep the sites alive? I mean, that's the first one. We had done double or triple our biggest day just for load testing. Of course we would, right? But this was even beyond that. So it was just a really interesting exercise. I now get to tell this story for the rest of my career because that's like, no, make it 10 times, like whatever that thing is. That was a big focus for the first couple of weeks. But then of course there's the idea of, how do you deal with how many products are out at any given point in time? How do you open up more slots for Canadians? How do you control demand? There's a lot of stuff that we're learning about how do you, right now we want to be able to, so for example, if for those who don't know what PC Express is, this is the ability for you to place an online order and you pick that up at a particular time slot. You know, and there's lots of lead time right now because GTA is busy, et cetera, across the country is busy. But how can we help these stores pick faster so that they can get through those slots as fast as possible? These are things that I had never really experienced as a PM before, that whole transition between the real world, you know, the real world, if you will, and our software product, to be able to say, okay, so how can I close this order faster so those pickers can start overnight so that they can process, you know, a certain number of orders a day? A lot of the changes that we've been doing are around that. And then other things that we're also doing is things like, you know, how do you support seniors and healthcare workers more explicitly? I won't get into any details. We will get there. It'll become public soon enough. But what does that look like to be able to help our most vulnerable populations? There's a whole bunch of stuff in there. And so, you know, the roadmap so far is we had all these beautiful OKRs for 2020, and we had all these initiatives, and we basically just threw them in the garbage because, you know, you can't really do most of that stuff right now. Things that you thought were important 2 months ago are really not very important right now. But it's starting to come back because things are starting to settle out. Yeah, it's been quite the experience, and you have to be super careful about the unintended consequences of the features that you put out there. Right. There's so many people using this app. You know, we tried to lock down a feature, and then all of a sudden something else was happening. It was kind of like those squishy balls that you squeeze and then it comes out the other side unintentionally. It's amazing, and you know really, really quickly with whether that's app reviews or customer support. Like our customer support lines have just, you know, blown up because of course people want questions answered, et cetera. So we threw a chat bot in there. I mean, you name it, everything has happened. It's been, this has been an eye-opening experience.
No kidding. No kidding. So we talked last week with Sean Olmsted, who's the VP at Bell. And, you know, I suspect you guys experienced something very similar to them in that, you know, the first 2 weeks was kind of adjusting to remote working, but it was also all hands on deck, right? And so like, what did you guys talk about when you sort of threw all of the OKRs out the window and said, okay, the world's changed? What's the principle that's driving you at that point?
I think that probably the best principle is we have a number of different things. The first one is, how do we serve our customers? Like, people need food, you know, like full stop, that's the number one priority. And how do we make it so that they can get what they're looking for? But then the other part of it is we also need to help our colleagues. So we have, you know, however many thousands of people working in stores, and how do we protect them so that they can continue to serve our customer? So those become the, you know, like, how do we keep the site up? That's a big one, so that people can get their food. And then how do we protect our colleagues so that they can continue to serve the customer? And it's been very enlightening, not enlightening. It's probably the most important work to do. You know, when you think of it that way, you're keeping Canadians fed. It's pretty inspiring, especially when you start seeing the feedback that's coming in from customers. Like they're so happy that we're keeping all these things happening. And yeah, that becomes the guiding light of what things are. I mean, you know, the idea of, I'm going to give you a swap from one brand to another, is that really important right now? We just need to get you fed. Like that's the most important thing. So it's that type of idea. It's not that the other things aren't important, but they're just not important now. So the themes have changed, but it's much all in service of the customer.
Yeah, very much still focused on serving the customer and understanding what the customer needs, as you say, right now. You know, like, it's not about those conversations we had with customers a year ago. It's, you know, what do they need now? So I'm going to shift a little bit over to the experimentation topic of, you know, that we promoted here. But I guess I'm part of what I'm interested in is that sense of customer focus and customer experience. What's their need right now, and how do you incorporate that into the experimentation stuff? So Nash, one of your big initiatives has been to create this kind of experimentation practice at Loblaw Digital, and we see that in a lot of companies, you know, that I talk to. They're working on this idea of rapid experimentation for learning and validation. before they make big investments in development. And you guys have, you've been doing this for what, a year or more? You've scaled it from just a handful of experiments to now, you say you're running like 75 last year and you want to like triple that this year. Tell us a little bit how that came about in the sense of focusing on experimentation, and what are your teams doing to increase that velocity so much?
So when we started out, when I started out at LD 4 years ago, they had bought a tool called SiteSpect, and SiteSpect was sort of a technically complicated tool and made it really hard to test, but it was a really sort of powerful tool, and it was run by a startup out of Boston. And personally, we had a pretty good thing going. The problem was it was hard to scale to a self-serve model. And we then decided that we were going to look at other players. And so we looked at Optimizely and Adobe. And to be perfectly candid, we're pretty deeply invested in the Adobe stack. And so I think that was one part of the reason that Adobe did okay. We use their audience manager, we use their analytics tools, and so there was a bit of an advantage for Adobe to fit into that existing tool chain. And so what ended up happening was we'd learned previously that running experiments is not easy because everyone's got kind of a day job and they keep getting told that they should run experiments, but they're not given the support typically to do it. So it's not sort of a part-time thing. So we hired 2 folks who had experience with experimentation. So they were very sort of, they were very competent with target and analytics and just very comfortable with numbers. And so when they arrived, one of the first things they did is they set up, so we decided that, and I had the support of a couple of really important people to do this, otherwise I don't think it would have taken off. One was the director of analytics, Nabil. And Nabil was aligned that the right way to do this is to build kind of a center of excellence type thing, which is like a complete no-no these days. But, the truth is that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with it. There is something wrong with thinking that's the only way. And, once you have that, everything's done. So Nabil and I had some really great conversations about how we structure this. We went and talked to our VP, Lauren, and told her that, we think this is the right way to do it. And she's like, okay. So it was a bit of because we were asking for new headcount, and asking for headcount is all, like, even though, we're growing quite a bit, you really do need to justify it. I think the only real exception to that is sort of developers, because they're, even harder to come by. So what ended up happening was we started building out this COE. And over the course of the first 3 months, we just met with everybody. We said, hey, this is what the process of filling up a backlog looks like. It doesn't look very different than a dev backlog. It's an experimentation backlog, but it's informed by the things you're trying to build. So I'll give you some examples. So on Joe Fresh, for example, we have, we have customer reviews for products. Great idea, right? Because customers have peer validation that the product is good, and it must be a peer saying, so they're happy about it and they trust that more. It turns out that it made no difference whether you had reviews or not. The other problem was it was hard to get a critical mass of reviews because most fashion these days is short-lived. So we ran this test, and with this test we had this evidence to say, what, it doesn't make sense. And at some point, it's not going to be included in our offering, and we're going to save the money that it costs, because it's not, ridiculously expensive, but it's not a cheap tool. And all of the savings go directly to the bottom line. So, it's a really valuable tool for us to become comfortable with this notion that, my common sense approach tells me this, my analytical sort of hat tells me this, but in the end, what's the data telling me? And that being said, I am a very strong proponent of reading the data, understanding it, making sure you understand its limitations, because there is still a place for, understanding and interpreting that data correctly, because that's important. Just because you have data doesn't mean that you're interpreting it correctly. So we set out this COE, and we created bunch of backlogs for each of the businesses. And then on the businesses, there was a ton of buy-in to do this because we'd also made it an LD wide OKR. Everyone was supposed to be in this together. And so we facilitated all these meetings. We helped them create backlogs. And then business teams, like in the last couple of weeks, Kim's team has had to run 2 experiments because they need to test something really quickly and they want to know what the impact of that change is going to be. Like Stacy's test that just went live. So.
Not as much results as I thought there would be, which is the point.
Well, exactly. We are constantly surprised. We think of ourselves as, I know this. I know the customer. I look at the analytics all the time. This is what's going to happen. I can, I put like $100 on it, and I don't do that a lot because I'm not a gambling fellow. But I would lose that $100 pretty frequently.
Yeah, you remember, Kim? You remember that old mantra? I think it might have been from early days of Pragmatic that your opinion, while interesting, is not what the data says. Right.
So that's true.
Great. Yeah.
And but that's the interesting thing. Marketplaces, we built it on a hypothesis, and we have to keep testing all these things because everything we think will happen, this will make the difference. Nope. So
yeah. So walk us through kind of the thinking process when you are experimenting. Like you start with a question or a hypothesis. How do you manage the scope and scale of that so that you're getting the data that is useful, but not necessarily over-investing in testing something? Either of you. Yeah.
Okay. I can take it.
You're the pro.
Okay. So typically what we'll do is, for example, we also ran an experiment for this, P with P and G with P that I mentioned earlier. Typically, we have a hypothesis because we have data from retail that says that, when these things are available, we see a lot of people buying them. We know this from sort of the loyalty data and so on. So they're pretty engaged. We know that this causes kind of a high degree of engagement, and it's a way for us to give value without cutting prices. Because in prestige beauty, for example, you're not allowed to cut prices. So now we have this initial hypothesis that people will really love this online just as much as they love it in store. Now, that may be true, but it may not be true, because when you go to the store, they usually have a gift with purchase sitting there, and it's like a physical object, and typically it's, nicely packaged and it looks nice and all of this stuff. So it creates an urge to purchase as well. Whereas online, we think that shopping is typically more task driven. And so people will, they'll add the thing to their cart and they'll check out if they want to and sort of go along their merry way. Turned out when we ran a test, we were sure that because of what we saw in retail, and when these things are available on the page, it would perform much better than when it wasn't available on the PDP. So this is made available on the PDP so that when your basket hits a certain size and it's available with a certain product, and you can make that decision. Turns out it doesn't matter, because the deal itself is so compelling that it's oversubscribed. So you could make a Cadillac version of this thing for people to do, but it's not really valuable. So our test basically told us, don't spend the effort now. At some point, when you run out of things to do, this will be a good thing to take on. I have a feeling that's a little while away.
Yeah, no kidding. Interesting. Well, we're getting some great questions on the chat, so let me pose a few of those, and we can talk about some of the interests that the participants have. So. Sure. Let's see. So maybe, shift a little bit. Actually, that's talking about your team. Maybe this one from Rhythm. Like after COVID, presuming there is an after COVID, yes, and things don't necessarily get back to normal, but the urgency kind of drops a bit, and you guys are able to sort of look back at more reasonable levels of traffic and stuff. Are you guys thinking of how you might retain users and sort of maintain the good parts of this behavior?
Actually, I think you should go first, Kim, because there's much greater impact on grocery than there is on the other businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I think that from a new customer acquisition perspective, what we were acquiring in a week, we're now acquiring, sorry, in a month or a quarter, we're acquiring in like less than a week. So just the scale is just crazy, but you have to now get those people to continue on that exercise. So I think that one of the growth teams are spending a lot of time trying to make sure that they support that life cycle and that people understand. We measure, I mean, Nash said it already, retail is like every day there's a measurement of things. We measure how many people are coming once, how many people come back twice during a period, like all these different things to be able to understand how that's coming away. Now they don't really have a choice, but we want to keep them around and get them to really like that service. So I think that a lot of the changes that we're making right now, albeit that they're COVID driven because of the urgency of it, a lot of them, because we're keeping the customer in mind, we really want it, the service is getting better as a result of that. So to want to keep them coming back and reuse and like using the service again and again.
Yeah, I think I want to echo that. You would think that on beauty and on apparel, which are in one's minds, non-essential purchases, you would think that there would be a decline in demand. And it's been precisely the opposite on both of those. They're sort of discretionary, I would say borderline luxury items, particularly prestige beauty is not cheap. So we expected things to get sort of rough for us. It turns out that there is a, baseline demand for these products. And now it's being just met through a different channel, which is the online channel, whereas before you could go in the store and pick these things up. But I agree with Kim's assessment that I think we are looking at ways to, I think there's a structural change that's happening. This thing is, even though, we're kind of in week 4, which is not short, I think it'll really dramatically raise the comfort levels for people shopping online. Because it may go on for another, who knows, 4 or 8 weeks, or goodness knows. I'm, obviously totally conjecturing, but the point is that it'll cause a change in habits sufficient that if we offer them the convenience and we know them well, so that, we're not like spamming them with nonsense offers and things like that, they will continue to shop with us past this, because many of them are talking like openly unsolicited feedback in our NPS surveys about how they didn't realize how great this was and they're not going back. So some people will for sure go back, but I think we'll definitely see a net growth out of this.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there's some fundamental changes that are occurring that are forcefully driven by the situation that will become, kind of, as everybody says, the new normal. But it was interesting, Don Tapscott wrote, I think it was last week or the week before, about sort of 10 things that will fundamentally change because of this. And one of those was absolutely people's comfort level of shopping and buying online and not necessarily having to physically travel to places. And that is a significant change. So I think you're absolutely right about that, and good to think about it. So we've got a couple of other questions here. So one of the things that you guys challenge, and you touched on it earlier, in a more complex environment, like retail and grocery and beauty, you're integrating with a lot of other systems, right? So legacy or otherwise, supply chain stuff, all kinds of things, right? So how much of a challenge, do those things pose as you're developing, digital features on the customer side?
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. They do pose a huge challenge from the perspective that these retail systems, when you think about when LD started, we rate ourselves on what's called penetration. So online sales penetration to total overall retail. And it was a tiny sliver at the beginning. Okay. And that sliver obviously is turning into a very narrow wedge at this point, and it'll get bigger and bigger over time. So when you think about what these systems were put in place for, they were put in place to support retail stores that had, these big, long software cycles that the software lived in point of sale, and, they were tested for months before they went out and things like that. You are now seeing more evolved model where people are building services. And the first thing that you have to take into account is that if you think we're going to build a set of back-end services and we're going to be great, for the next 2 years, you've got another thing coming, because, some system will get updated and suddenly, for instance, this is a real example, we haven't received beauty feeds for a week. And it turned up because someone on the merchandising team said, that price doesn't look right for this product. It's just like, and, so it goes back to my earlier point. Should we invest in like a bot that, ingests the feed and then automatically validates everything and says, okay, you're good to go, you can now ingest this feed and so on? Absolutely, we should. But can we do that now? The answer is no. So I think that the point is to sort of stage over time the acceptance of data into a sandbox, and then make sure that you work with that and you build sort of robust processes to ingest that data, put it in your sandbox, and then work with it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think there's, again, it's the prioritizing of urgent now versus longer term strategy. So you're learning a lot now, but you can't necessarily adapt to it all right away. And so that learning then affects your long-term stuff. Kim, a thought on that?
So one of my new jobs, because of all of this stuff, is to also help run the platform team for online grocery. So I am learning way more about those things than I ever thought I would learn over the last 2 weeks. And, realistically, what we're starting to do now is break things into specific services to try to put a gap between this monolith and us. And what does that look like? But the good thing about, we use a thing called Hybris, which sits on top of SAP, a big beast, but we're ripping it apart. And that's great. But the whole point is we're doing it based on how we see the usage now and prioritizing accordingly, because now we know, okay, that's a huge problem. Let's do that first so that we can continually provide better data to customers and keep those systems up. And, like every architecture, right? You have to break it into smaller and smaller services to make it more efficient. We're in the exact same boat. And, to Nash's point, you have to make sure that you're detached from the mothership from that perspective so that you don't take the site down.
Interesting. Yeah. So let's see, we've got a couple more here. I just saw one here that was kind of interesting. So let's talk a little bit about your teams and, kind of your leadership and management. Things have obviously changed with people working remotely. How are you overcoming that, both internally and externally?
Who wants to go first? Nash?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think Kim, you should talk about the exercise that you did with your team. I think it was really valuable and everyone really loved it. So, how you were the stuff you posted on LS Leads?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I think that we're doing a whole bunch of stuff, like trying to keep, I have a, 3 times a week coffee chat with my team where we just talk about what we're working on, that kind of stuff. We have a weekly thing called Roundup where we present to everybody. There are a bunch of social calendar stuff, but I also did a retro with my team yesterday which is what Nash is referring to, which is the, what's working, what's not working, what can we do differently? Because we forget to ask that question. We really do need to block off time for lunch, because the idea of sitting in this chair for 9 hours with no breaks has been a reality. And it needs to stop, because you don't even get that break to go to the next meeting room, that's pretty insane. We've also had to put in there will be no meetings after X core hours, because people are starting to be just working all the time. So I think it's that type of stuff, making sure that that's communicating, but also being well aware that people are, dealing with families or dealing with all this stuff that is super distracting within this environment, and being flexible with that.
Yeah, for sure. I think so, from a personal standpoint, how have you guys sort of, shifted, or, have you learned some lessons about your own management style that you could share a little bit? Nash?
I'll say a couple things that I think I need to get better at, and I have been since the whole crisis started. our work environment is pretty hectic, and there's often a lot of asks for us to attend sort of last minute things. And often what it means is that we're not able to, we have to reschedule meetings that, we don't, like, that would be considered rude, basically, because you're just like, 2 minutes before you're like, hey, sorry, I can't make it. Can we do this another time? Not really a great way to behave. And so I've gotten much more rigorous about saying things like, yeah, sorry, I know there's a thing in that window, but I just can't move it. Or getting, every time previously I would just request an update, like I propose a new time for a meeting. But this, I think I'm being more delicate around that. I'll speak to the person before saying, hey, this extenuating circumstances made it necessary. Just, I think some things like that. So making sure that, I'm not taking the team for granted. Like Kim, I'm doing less frequently, twice weekly on Mondays and Thursdays. I meet with the team, and 20 minutes of the hour, we have a regular hour team meeting on Mondays. 20 minutes is blocked off for just, you're actually not allowed to talk about work. You shoot the breeze, you talk about, like, whether you went for a walk and how you coped and what you cooked and what you drank. And it's actually a really warm thing. And I think we want to continue it. And then on Thursdays, we have a 30-minute meeting where we do this. That being said, we're also, what Kim mentioned, these dark hours, we're really trying to respect those a lot. I'm using the feature to, like, send updates in the morning, so that if I send an email I'm trying myself not to work at night, because I'm, like, young. They're not young, actually. They're good age because they're independent. But I'm trying to make sure that if I ever work in the evenings, I'm not sending out those emails in the evening, causing dings on people's phones and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I think, we've heard that from some other leaders, that they've really had to pay more attention to kind of flexible work hours. Single mother who's in a condo with a small child and, like, doesn't have any daycare, suddenly that completely changes the dynamic, right?
Yeah.
And so, you become much more aware of how you can adapt and manage those changes to circumstances. That's great. That's great. Yeah, good. We're almost out of time. I guess we have room for a couple more questions. So one of the ones that's coming up here is from Javier. Javier, talking about how have you prioritized what to focus on, that sort of is beyond, like, your specific team. Like, is there a kind of a task force that's saying, okay, here's the shifting priorities, how does everybody align? Or, like, what are the ways you're kind of prioritizing and communicating that through the teams?
Shall I take this one, Nash?
Sure, go for it, Kim.
So I think that unfortunately, I'm going to say the pat product management answer, it depends. Which is, for example, we have customer support will tell us when things are happening. Gail and Weston is currently getting emails from customers about what's happening. That one gets some attention. And then we also have OSAT, which is NPS in other organizations, telling us what's working and what's not working. And then we also have feedback from the stores. So a lot of those things, they all coalesce into some root issues. And that becomes a lot of the things that we're focused on. Because they, realistically, it's the same sort of problem, but you just hear it from different perspectives. For example, if people are getting shorted a lot of food, okay, what does that look like? And it becomes a multifaceted solution. Or if, the slots are super filled up, what does that look like? Or, whatever that may be. If Instacart has got problems, it also becomes our problem. So we definitely get it from all these different places. And realistically, we do use numbers too. We have to say, okay, how many people are affected by this problem? Is it as important as this other burning fire over here? And what does that look like? I mean, granted, there is a lot of teams at Loblaw Digital, so you can divide and conquer. So there's definitely an opportunity to do that. I mean, I'm really pleased that I wasn't involved in the site stability project. Let the tech guys figure that out. But I mean, yeah, it comes from everywhere. So that's what I mean by it depends.
Yeah, that's shades of old Two Cows days, right?
Oh.
The operations center is like, oh my God, no.
Yeah, I don't need to relive that. No, I'm good.
There are other people more capable than I. Yeah,
100%.
That's great. That's great. Well, this has been fantastic, you guys. I really want to thank you for taking the time out of your day and your busy, sort of frontline work in a way. I mean, you are part of essential teams. So thank you for doing what you're doing. And kudos to Galen for communicating. I think he's been very personable and honest and open. It's been really great to see. And for me anyway, personally, mostly the shop experience has been pretty good. So you are having an impact. So thank you for that. And thanks for taking the time today to talk to us.
Follow Product AMA on Twitter and send us your topic suggestions. We look forward to seeing you soon.